For nearly 5 centuries, starting in 1492 when Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage, the idea of the discovery of America remained an undisputed fact. Columbus's name and his great achievement were firmly etched into textbooks worldwide, celebrated by entire nations, and his feat was recounted to generations of school children as an indisputable historical axiom. However, in the fateful 1960s, this seemingly unshakable historical foundation wavered, then collapsed entirely. The world learned of a sensational revelation. America was not discovered by Columbus at all. The first discoverers turned out to be the Vikings, the valiant seafarers of the North. The evidence that could overturn all previous notions of the past was an old but astonishing parchment scroll, known as the Vinland Map. Experts claimed it was the first cartographic depiction of the American continent, dated to 1440, a full half-century before Columbus's ships reached the New World. But was the Vinland Map authentic? If it was an elaborate forgery, its creator was undoubtedly a genius of deception. The map was too intricate and incredibly beautiful to be a mere trick. Some researchers, upon seeing it, were convinced it is real. Since its appearance, the map has undergone an unprecedented series of forensic examinations, yet even the world's leading scientists remain divided on its authenticity. If the map is genuine, it represents one of the most captivating and valuable historical documents. If not, it is the greatest deception ever perpetrated against the cartographic community in centuries. Not only millions of dollars were at stake, but also the impeccable careers of respected scholars and the reputation of one of the world's most revered institutions. We see no other option but that it is a fake, a modern 20th century fake, skeptics declared. From library vaults in Nazi-occupied Austria to high-tech laboratories in sunny California, a true battle for truth unfolded. Is the Vinland Map a grand hoax or a genuine testament to the past? Can science finally provide a definitive answer to this question that has long plagued minds? Today, within the walls of the Yale Library, the Vinland Map is carefully preserved for further study. It was once proclaimed a cartographic artifact capable of rewriting history, challenging the accepted belief about Columbus and establishing the Vikings as the first Europeans to set foot on the New World. However, currently, only selected scholars have access to it, their mission being not to study its historical value, but to definitively determine its authenticity. Library staff emphasize their neutral position. We don't take a particular position on the Vinland Map. Our job is to make material available for scholars to use. As to whether it's real or fake, that's for the scholars who are studying it to decide. If they decide it's authentic, it'll be the most valuable map in the world. If not, it's just a useless piece of parchment. The story of this mysterious map's emergence begins in London, in the distant year 1957. That's when two booksellers, the Englishman D.I. Davies and the Italian Enzo Ferrajoli, arrived at the renowned British Museum. Their visit was driven by hope. Ferrajoli and Davies were offering an intriguing ancient volume for sale and sincerely wished for the museum's experts to confirm its authenticity. The main part of the book consisted of an ancient medieval manuscript known as the Tartar Relation. This document was a detailed account of a 13th century papal mission aimed at gathering intelligence on the court of the powerful Mongol rulers, whose military might inspired awe. The manuscript proposed by Ferrajoli and Davies had been recopied by monks in the 15th century and bound together with a world map that, at first glance, seemed to be an illustration for the text. And there it was, this map, capable of changing history. East of Europe, it meticulously depicted lands conquered by the Mongols, the majestic Himalayas, and even the distant island of Japan. But it was to the west of European shores that it held its most astonishing secret. It showed Iceland, Greenland, and most importantly, the New World, something that had never before been recorded on a map. This was a distant island in the North Atlantic, labeled as Vinlanda, which, it became clear, was America. In a black and white depiction, America was shown in the context of recognizable parts of the world, such as Africa and Asia, as well as the Scandinavian countries and Great Britain. There was no doubt about its location. Could this map serve as irrefutable proof that the Vikings had set foot in America long before Columbus? At the time, the only mention of such an event was merely two Scandinavian chronicles known as the Vinland Sagas. The sagas, by their very nature, were oral narratives passed down through generations. Some served to instruct descendants, but others were more for entertainment, which undermined their status as reliable historical sources. The Vikings were, without a doubt, the greatest explorers of the Middle Ages. Their sturdy, Expertly built ships and unparalleled seafaring skills allowed them to undertake incredible journeys far from their Scandinavian homeland, crossing the harsh and unpredictable waters of the North Atlantic. By 870, they had reached the shores of Iceland, and a century later, they successfully colonized Greenland. And now, this mysterious map not only depicted Vinland, identifying it as a territory of America, but also contained a short but extremely important inscription above Vinland, describing its discovery specifically by the Vikings. Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, the Vinland Map called into question 500 years of established history, the very history taught in school textbooks. Many who grew up with stories of Columbus felt this as a true upheaval in their worldview. In 1957, when booksellers Farajoli and Davies first presented the map to the British Museum, it became the first serious, tangible evidence, beyond mere oral sagas, that the Vikings had indeed discovered America. The Vinland Map looked so convincing that two museum experts, without hesitation, expressed full confidence in its authenticity. However, the head of the manuscripts department, Bertram Schofield, harbored deep doubts. He was concerned that Farajoli flatly refused to disclose any information about the map's previous history, its origin, or how it came into his possession. In reality, behind Farajoli's charm lay a rather dark past. He was a staunch fascist who fought alongside General Franco during the Spanish Civil War. Moreover, some sources claimed he had a reputation for being involved in highly questionable, if not shadowy, dealings. He was remarkably adept at reading human nature, knowing precisely whom he could sway with modest offerings, dinner invitations, choice cigars, strong spirits, and fine wines. In other words, he was excellent at assessing everyone to gain their trust. Nevertheless, Bertram Schofield denied the Vinland Map official recognition from the British Museum. Without confirmation of authenticity, Farajoli and Davies would be unable to command a high price for it. Given this, they decided to try a different strategy. Geneva at the time was one of the key centers for rare book trade in Europe. One Swiss dealer, whose firm was run by Nicholas Rauch, regularly held series of auctions dedicated to books and manuscripts related to the great geographical discoveries of America. However, without irrefutable proof of authenticity, Rauch would not put the Vinland Map up for sale. Nevertheless, he kindly introduced Farajoli to a young American dealer named Lawrence Whitten. This man possessed extraordinary erudition, mastering most Western European languages, being an outstanding Latinist, and his catalog descriptions invariably featured the deepest analysis. He was truly a knowledgeable and insightful dealer. Away from the bustling attention of the sales floor, Farajoli offered Whitten the Vinland Map. Despite the map's lack of proper provenance, Whitten, as he later noted in his publication for Yale University, was completely captivated. He confessed, "Whatever the Vinland Map and the Tartar relation might ultimately prove to be, I had fallen under their undeniable spell." In 1957, Whitten acquired the volume containing the Vinland Map from Farajoli, paying $3,500 for it. By 1957 standards, this was a significant sum, but if he could prove that the Vinland Map was created before Columbus arrived in America in 1492, he could make a fortune. At his home near Yale, where he was then a graduate student, Whitten transformed into a true research detective. He began his investigation by attempting to date the manuscript with which the map was bound, namely the Tartar relation. This ancient text was written primarily on paper, and Whitten managed to discover faint bull's head watermarks on it. By cross-referencing with reference materials, he was able to convincingly show that this paper was manufactured in 1441. This discovery confirmed that the Tartar relation was a genuine medieval manuscript. However, the map itself was drawn on parchment, that is, specially treated animal skin, and therefore had no identifiable watermarks. What was its true date? Whitten's strategy was to prove that the Vinland Map had always been bound with the Tartar relation, whose authenticity scholars generally did not dispute. In the process of his careful examination, he stumbled upon crucial evidence: wormholes left by bookworms. If he could demonstrate that these pest-eaten holes perfectly aligned from one document to another, it would serve as irrefutable proof that the Vinland Map and the Tartar relation had always been bound together and, therefore, must have been created around the same time. However, despite all his persistent attempts, Whitten never managed to achieve a complete match of the wormholes. He found himself at a dead end. A year later, his luck unexpectedly changed due to a striking turn of events. A friend from the Yale Library brought Whitten a portion of a famous medieval historical work written by a Dominican friar named Vincent of Beauvais. This work was titled The Mirror of History Speculum Historial. That same evening, after dinner, he sat down with the new manuscript and began comparing it to the Tartar relation in the Vinland Map. Immediately, he was struck by an astonishing coincidence. My adrenaline started to pump when it dawned on me that the wormholes in the Vinland Map exactly matched those at the beginning of Vincent of Beauvai's Mirror, and those in the Tartar relation matched just as perfectly those at the end of the same volume. As far as I could tell, the Vinland Map was authenticated here and now, beyond all reasonable doubt. It now became clear that the Vinland Map had once been part of a medieval volume containing two genuine ancient documents. The map was located at the beginning of the volume, followed by the Mirror of History, and finally, the Tartar relation. Bookworms had eaten through the manuscripts, leaving wormholes as irrefutable evidence connecting the map to the mirror and the mirror to the Tartar relation. Witten was absolutely convinced of the Vinland Map's authenticity. Witten immediately offered to sell his discovery to Yale University. Alexander Veeder, the curator of the map collection, sought assistance from one of the university's wealthiest and most generous alumni, billionaire Paul Mellon. Mellon was deeply intrigued by the prospect that a single map could fundamentally rewrite world history. The exact sum he ultimately paid was never officially disclosed, but in exchange for what was estimated to be hundreds of thousands of dollars, Anna Mellon, Alexander Veeder's wife, set one crucial condition: complete secrecy. He wanted it to be a splash in the world, for everyone to be excited, and it would change all history. So my husband came back and said, "You've got to keep this a secret and not tell anybody, because otherwise I'll be in big trouble with Mellon." Yale University, maintaining confidentiality, selected 3 scholars to conduct a quiet and thorough authentication of the map. While these experts were working, a remarkable archaeological discovery provided additional confirmation to the Vinland Map's message that the Vikings were the first Europeans to reach the Americas. Beginning in 1960, Norwegian researchers Helga and Stein Ingstad searched for evidence of Viking presence on the Canadian coast. In the fishing village of Lansax Meadows, located in Newfoundland, they were led to the remains of what locals described as an Indian camp. The Ingstads began their archaeological investigations. Over the following years, their efforts culminated in the discovery of fragments of what appeared to be typical 11th century Viking structures. The artifacts found within these structures left no doubt. The only people capable of producing bronze ring pins and iron nails of this type were the Vikings. The announcements made by the Ingstads served as irrefutable archaeological confirmation that the Norsemen preceded Christopher Columbus in the discovery of America. By 1965, Yale University was ready to unveil its carefully guarded secret to the world. 3 distinguished scholars had completed a monumental publication in preparation for the Vinland Map's presentation. The only remaining question was the optimal date for the public announcement. Yale's benefactor, Paul Mellon, served as an advisor on this matter. He recalled, "In those days, everyone had a thin diary, and no one was pulling out there. I'm going hunting, I'm going fishing, and so on." Suddenly, on October 11th, he was going to be at a meeting in New Haven, and he said that would be the perfect time. The date chosen by Mellon proved exceptionally audacious and provocative. October 11th was the eve of Columbus Day, a holiday traditionally dedicated to the great navigator's discovery of America. The launch party was lavish and grand. Its centerpiece was an ice sculpture of a Viking longship, expertly crafted by Yale chefs. As high-ranking ambassadors mingled with scholars, Alexander Veeder playfully donned a helmet gifted by the King of Norway. The Vinland Map was declared a triumphant achievement for both Yale University and its billionaire benefactor. However, the press and certain segments of the public greeted the news of the map with noticeable hostility. The general public firmly believed that Columbus discovered America, as that's what they had been taught in school. And suddenly, they were told that America was discovered not by Columbus, but by the Vikings. Italian Americans were particularly upset, as Columbus, their national hero, was being stripped of his central place in the historical narrative. One of them expressed his indignation. 21 million Americans will resent this slight on Columbus, especially if it's released on the day we honor him. Do you have children? I have one boy. So you're going to send him in here, and he'll never know it. I'm very concerned about that. Beyond wounded national pride and widespread public outcry, there were legitimate concerns about the heightened secrecy surrounding the map prior to its public presentation. Authenticating the map was an exceedingly complex and multifaceted task. It required deep knowledge in orthography, paleography, material science, history, and, in particular, the history of the ancient North. It would seem absurd to assume that any three individuals could competently assess all these aspects. A year after the map's grand presentation, Yale University, in conjunction with the Smithsonian Institution, organized a large-scale conference, inviting a broader range of experts for a comprehensive examination of the cartographic document. These scholars noted inexplicable anomalies and questioned several key aspects. Why was the Vikings' own Scandinavian homeland drawn with astonishing carelessness? Why was Greenland depicted with surprising accuracy as an island, even though it was not circumnavigated and fully mapped until the late 19th century? And, perhaps the most devastating evidence undermining the map's authenticity was the fact that Vikings, according to available records, never engaged in mapmaking. Their navigational skills were based on a deep understanding of the natural environment. They knew much better what was going on around them. If it suddenly got cloudy and you couldn't orient yourself, which direction is the wave going? Just keep the wave in the same aspect, in the same direction, and we know we'll stay on course. While we're contacting a satellite to know where we are, they used all these natural things around them to say, "I'm about here." They preserved their extensive maritime knowledge through oral tradition and in their memory, visualizing the world around them not through graphic images that others could see. In fact, there is not a single cartographic artifact showing any cartographic drawings from Northern Europe in the Middle Ages. As the growing chorus of doubts about the map's authenticity intensified, Yale University decided that scientific research might confirm its genuineness. In early 1967, the map, along with the mirror and Tartar relation manuscripts, were transported to London, back to the British Museum. All three manuscripts underwent thorough examination under ultraviolet light. The test showed that the inks from the Tartar relation and mirror of history actively absorbed ultraviolet radiation and therefore appeared intensely black. However, the lines on the Vinland map did not appear black. Instead, they flew arrest. British Museum scientists reported that the inks on the Vinland map did not match the composition of inks used in the two other confirmed manuscripts, and, in fact, in any other documents from that period. What could this mean? Yale University returned the map to the US and sought assistance from a specialized firm in Chicago. Walter Macrone had gained renown as a pioneer in using microscopy for forensic analysis. He achieved widespread international recognition by investigating the mysteries surrounding the deaths of Napoleon and Beethoven, and by revealing compelling evidence that the Shroud of Turin, depicting Jesus, was an elaborate forgery. Walter Macrone and his colleague Anna Titsov focused their scientific investigations on the famous Vinland Map. Using low magnification, they discovered that the images on the map visually consisted not of one, but of two overlapping lines. One was a yellow line, and over it, in uneven strokes, ran a black line or small fragments of black pigment. The yellow line was strikingly clear, while the black line appeared heavily faded. Macrone asked Titsov to take microscopic particles of the yellow line for subsequent analysis using a polarized light optical instrument. Titsov had the ability to adjust the direction of light passing through a substance and determine its composition by the specific characteristics of light refraction and absorption. On the Vinland map, when light fell on the surface, the yellow ink particles appeared white, but when light passed through the map, the yellow ink appeared dark. These unusual refractive properties became a key indicator of the ink's chemical composition. It turned out to be an unusual substance, presumably something like anatase. Anatase is a modification of titanium dioxide that exists naturally as a mineral formation or, after appropriate processing, serves perfectly as a component for paints and pigments due to its light-reflecting qualities. Anna Titsov carefully extracted a particle from the yellow line of the map and examined it under significantly higher magnification. She employed a transmission electron microscope, which provides an exceptionally detailed image of particle size and shape. Irregular, pointed particles, varying significantly in size, generally indicate the natural origin of anatase, obtained by hand-grinding mineral raw materials. However, the samples taken by Macrone from the Vinland map showed a different morphology. The yellow particles were almost identical in size and had smooth, rounded contours. This unequivocally indicated the synthetic origin of the anatase, and synthetic anatase was not widely available or produced on an industrial scale before 1917. From that moment, it became obvious that this was not an ancient artifact. This ink was modern. Macrone and Titsov presented their findings to Yale University. If the ink was modern, the Vinland map was most likely a forgery. The professional reputations of prominent scholars were severely threatened. Relations between Yale and its generous patron became extremely strained. The authority of one of the world's most respected academic institutions was undermined, and the most expensive cartographic document in the world risked turning into an utterly worthless fake. Yale University demanded an independent expert examination. Since the late 1970s, a research group at the University of California, Davis, led by distinguished physicist Thomas Cahill, had been using advanced nuclear technology to identify atmospheric pollutants. He had successfully used a similar approach to study the Gutenberg Bible in detail. At the strong recommendation of the authoritative Smithsonian Institution and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Yale University invited Cahill to determine if his innovative method could clarify the mystery of the Vinland Map. Inside a 10-foot concrete protective shell was a powerful cyclotron. It uses an exceptionally strong magnetic field to accelerate protons to colossal speeds. The protons are then formed into a narrowly focused beam, traveling through a steel vacuum tube. When the beam hits an object, it produces a unique spectral fingerprint, allowing for the precise determination of the content of each element present in the sample. The sensitivity of this method was extremely high, allowing, in essence, the detection of elements in quantities as small as 1,000th of a millionth of a gram of substance. Over 2 days in 1985, Cahill's team conducted over 100-point measurements across the entire surface of the Vinland Map. First, they analyzed areas including both ink strokes and the parchment itself. Then they analyzed areas of clean parchment. In the case of the Vinland Map, we have parchment and just a tiny amount of ink on its surface. You need to know the composition of the parchment so you can isolate the pure ink composition. So we would always measure the parchment right next to the ink line. Take 2 measurements, subtract the parchment. What was left was the ink. Cahill was then able to determine the complete list of chemical elements contained in the map's ink. Walter Macrone had indicated significant concentrations of titanium or anatase, but Cahill was astonished to find virtually no trace of this element. The biggest surprise was that when we first did the ink analysis, we barely detected any titanium. We expected to find huge amounts of titanium, but it wasn't there. The results obtained essentially directly contradicted Macrone's findings. Cahill asserted that if anatase, a form of titanium dioxide, were indeed present in the ink, his analyses would have registered significantly higher concentrations of titanium. He hypothesized that the particles analyzed by Macrone might have been contaminated, possibly by modern paint flakes that had fallen from the ceiling. Even a minute amount of such material, landing on the map, could have been mistaken for ink crystals during sampling, and then, upon analysis, would appear as modern paint. It's highly probable that this was, in fact, modern paint. However, Anatase F. of Macrone's team emphatically maintained that her samples were extracted directly from the yellow lines drawn on the map. Many of these particles remained firmly attached to minute fragments of the parchment, essentially being directly linked to it. Thus, 2 highly authoritative and reliable analytical methodologies appeared to be in direct contradiction. A crucial question remained unresolved. What was the nature of the yellowish pigment present in the ink, which Macrone and Anatase had identified? Was it anatase in its modern synthetic modification, as Macrone suspected, which would inevitably indicate that the Vinland Map was a forgery? Or did the ink conceal other, as yet undisclosed, mysteries? The ink's color corresponded to the characteristic brown hue expected for a map centuries old, and how the scribe achieved this effect remained a minor enigma. Brody Neuenschwander, a distinguished art historian and talented calligrapher, possesses a unique ability to reproduce the handwriting of ancient scribes. He purposefully applies his extensive knowledge and practical skills to investigate methods applicable to the falsification of medieval manuscripts. Initially, I was drawn to medieval manuscripts, and I genuinely sought to master the technique of imitating ancient writing styles. In doing so, it's certainly impossible to truly reproduce authentic medieval script without a deep understanding of the composition of the inks used in the Middle Ages, Neuenschwander explains. Among the most common inks of that era were the so-called iron gall inks. These inks were inexpensive and relatively simple to produce. Their creation involved the use of oak galls, specific growths formed on oak trees due to the life cycle of insect larvae. The collected galls were meticulously ground into a fine powder, which was then boiled in water, yielding a solution similar in consistency and color to tea. To this solution, gum arabic was added, serving as a binding agent, along with iron sulfate, an iron-rich mineral. The essence of transforming this mixture into ink lies in the chemical reaction between the iron contained in the iron sulfate and the tannin derived from the oak. As a result of this reaction, a process akin to rusting occurs on the parchment, Neuenschwander clarifies. The tannin and iron, interacting on the page, oxidize, effectively burning the letters into the surface. It is interesting to note that the English word ink originates from the Greek enkion, which literally means to burn in. Over time, this burning in process leads to a characteristic color change in iron gall inks. Initially, the pen strokes leave a grayish trace, which blackens within an hour or two, and within the next year or two, it acquires a rich black color. However, after a century or two, it begins to brown, the historian recounts. Many medieval manuscripts, including the Tartar Relation and Speculum Historial, which were discovered alongside the Vinland Map, exhibit a brownish tint caused by the corrosion of iron gall inks. However, the ink used on the Vinland Map was not iron gall. Macron's theory posited that the forger likely attempted to imitate the darkening effect characteristic of corroded iron gall inks by applying black ink over a yellow pigment. Macron asserted that the yellow pigment contained anatase, a modern synthetic material, which could unequivocally indicate the map's inauthenticity. In contrast, Cale objected, stating that he detected virtually no titanium, the primary component of anatase. He concluded that anatase was not part of the ink, and therefore, the map could well be authentic. Thus, the debate regarding the Vinland Map's authenticity reached a stalemate, and the resolution of this dispute depended entirely on the chemical composition of the ink. If the Vinland Map's ink truly contained modern anatase, then the map was a forgery. The question arose, could a new scientific technique definitively resolve this long-standing dispute about the ink? In the summer of 2002, Professor Robin Clark and chemist Catherine Brown were invited to Yale University to conduct research on the Vinland Map using a method known as Raman microspectroscopy. Currently, Catherine Brown demonstrates this innovative technique at Maggs Brothers in London, one of the world's largest and oldest antique bookstores. Raman microscopy is a scientific method that employs lasers to precisely identify various materials. The essence of the process is that a monochromatic laser beam is focused on a material on a surface. The materials themselves modify this light, and it reflects back multicolored, forming a unique spectrum. The resulting spectrum is absolutely unique to the material that produces it, acting like a fingerprint, allowing these materials to be identified, Brown explains. For instance, this 15th century manuscript was illuminated, or colored, with various pigments. The Raman microprobe is capable of identifying each of them. The red color is due to cinnabar, the blue to lapis lazuli, and the white to lead white. The ink itself turned out to be iron gall. Since every molecule possesses unique characteristics, the spectrum it produces is also unique to each type of molecule. That's absolutely right. We either know what the material is or we don't, Brown asserts. Beyond its exceptional precision, this technique possesses an additional significant advantage. Raman microspectroscopy is particularly valuable for examining documents because it is non-invasive and non-destructive. This means it causes absolutely no harm to the manuscript or document we are examining, which is extremely important given their priceless nature, Brown emphasizes. Thus, this technique proved to be an ideal tool for resolving the dispute over the authenticity of the world's most valuable map. Brown and Clark directed their laser beam onto the Vinland Map. On the Vinland Map, we confidently confirmed the presence of anatase in the yellowish-brown lines located beneath the black ink. We were certainly able to detect it on the ink, but not on the body of the map itself, Brown reported. The presence of anatase specifically in the ink, and not on the parchment, combined with Macron's already established finding that the anatase was synthetic, could mean only one thing. This was not something that could have accidentally fallen on top. It was intentionally incorporated into the ink. This absolutely confirmed Macron's original conclusions. The only conclusion we could draw from the data obtained was that the Vinland Map was created sometime after 1920. So what do all these accumulated pieces of evidence boil down to? The absence of any other maps reliably made by Vikings, Macron's conclusions that the ink on the Vinland Map contains synthetic anatase produced after 1917, and now the definitive confirmation by Brown and Clark. To date, every conceivable test that could be done has been done, and the conclusion to date is that the map is a fake, it's a modern forgery, the expert concludes. So, if the famous Vinland Map turned out to be a forgery, the question of its creator's identity inevitably arises. Can a scientific approach, with its meticulous analysis and painstaking search, shed light on this latest puzzle in the history of such a mysterious cartographic artifact? One figure comes into focus, the Italian bookseller Enzo Ferrajoli. It was through him that the Vinland Map and the so-called Tartar relation became linked, and it was later discovered that Ferrajoli also brokered the sale of the Speculum Historiale. Ferrajoli chose Spain as his adopted home, and it is on the Iberian Peninsula. Researchers believe that important keys to unraveling this mystification lie hidden. In the city of Zaragoza, within La Seo Cathedral, one of Spain's largest libraries is housed. In 1957, a scholar discovered that manuscripts he had previously worked with had mysteriously disappeared. A subsequent investigation revealed a startling disappearance. Over 100 priceless texts had vanished without a trace from the collection. Police swiftly apprehended the main suspect, Enzo Ferrajoli. At a special tribunal, the prosecution presented compelling evidence, asserting that Ferrajoli had managed to charm librarians who provided him with unlimited access to their holdings. Apparently, Ferrajoli acted extremely slowly and methodically, the court heard. He borrowed books and did not return them. He carried them out, skillfully hidden in newspapers, in the back of his briefcase. And, of course, the most perfect part of his scheme was the destruction of the index cards so that no one could demand these books. Worse still, these books are not here because they are not listed in the registry. Ferrajoli was found guilty of theft and sentenced to 8 years and 1 day in prison, but was subsequently released early due to health reasons. It remains unknown whether the Tartar relation and Speculum Historiale were among the documents stolen from Zaragoza, but meanwhile, a new witness emerged, ready to provide even more incriminating information about Enzo Ferrajoli's past. This witness was Diego Gomez Flores, a retired rare book dealer. Born in France, he immigrated to Spain after World War II. Gomez first met Enzo Ferrajoli in Barcelona and vividly remembers a day in the mid-1950s when Ferrajoli gave him a ride in his distinctive Fiat Topolino. At that time, Ferrajoli, without concealing his pride, boasted that he had acquired the manuscript of the Tartar relation and had bound it together with the map. He claimed they had kept it for decades and placed it in the binding to pass it off as genuine. The map had to be bound. Gomez recalled Ferrajoli saying, "That was the way they were able to sell the book, as if the map was part of it, and it worked." Gomez Flores's account suggests that the Vinland Map was originally a separate parchment, and that Ferrajoli skillfully bound it together with the Tartar relation, with the aim of significantly increasing its market value. However, Gomez's recollections leave one key question unanswered. Where did Ferrajoli obtain the map itself? Historian Kirsten Seaver dedicated a decade of her life to meticulously studying European archives, striving to uncover the origins of this forgery. Once I was convinced that the map was a fake, I started looking for all possible suspects across Europe, she explained. It had to be someone with the necessary knowledge, and I narrowed down the search to one person. Seaver's research led her to the firm conviction that Father Joseph Fischer, an Austrian Jesuit priest, possessed all the necessary means, opportunities, and motives to create such a masterpiece of deception. From 1895 to 1939, Fischer lived and taught at the prestigious Austrian college Stella Macetina, which attracted students from all corners of Europe, including such prominent figures as Sherlock Holmes author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Irish novelist James Joyce. Fischer was a recognized authority in the field of 15th and 16th century world maps. In 1902, he published a book in which he put forth a radically new theory that challenged 500 years of cartographic history. Father Fischer was one of the first to suggest that the Vikings were the true discoverers of America. Father Fischer undoubtedly harbored a special passion for discovering maps that demonstrated something first. It was he who discovered the first map on which the name America appeared. He was also unswervingly convinced that the Norse had, without a doubt, discovered America and that they had left behind detailed records of their voyages to Vinland. Although Father Fischer himself never found such a map, Seaver uncovered evidence suggesting that he had all the necessary materials and equipment to create his own. His scholarly position provided him with unhindered access to blank parchment from medieval manuscripts. Father Fischer was also an artist who could have taught him the art of mixing pigments in such a way that the ink would appear significantly older than its actual age. Seaver even discovered a striking similarity between Fischer's handwriting and the text inscribed on the Vinland Map. There are two types of handwriting on the Vinland Map, she noted, both of which have enough indications of Father Fischer to warrant careful investigation. But what could have been Father Fischer's motivating factor? Seaver asserts that Fischer was so firmly convinced that the Vikings had discovered America that in the mid-1930s, he decided to create a map that he believed should have existed. He would not have seen it as falsifying the cartographical record, Seaver believes. I also very much doubt that he created the map deliberately for others to see. I think it was, in essence, a private exercise. However, Father Fisher's private research was destined to collide with global historical events. In 1938, German troops entered Austria, seized Stella Macetina College, evicted the priest, and confiscated all valuable property, including artworks, rare books, and, as Seaver believes, the very Vinland Map created by Father Fisher. Adolf Hitler's campaign for world domination was fueled by a deep belief in the superiority of the Aryan race, embodied, in his conviction, by the German people, who were believed to trace their cultural roots to the valiant Vikings. In the hands of the Nazi regime, the Vinland Map could have become a powerful historical justification for claims to American territories and, consequently, a formidable political tool. If Seaver's assumptions are correct, Father Fisher, using his extensive knowledge of ancient cartography and Viking history, masterfully created the Vinland Map on genuine medieval parchment. Subsequently, this map, created by Fisher, was confiscated by the Germans, and after their defeat, it came into the possession of Enzo Ferrajoli, a known fascist and supporter of Nazi ideas. The foremost step in determining whether Father Fisher was the true forger became a thorough examination of the parchment on which the Vinland Map was drawn, with the aim of establishing its medieval origin. One of the recognized methods for dating parchment is radiocarbon analysis. Since parchment is carefully processed animal hide, this technique utilizes the principle of the regular decay of carbon atoms to determine the date within a probable range of accuracy. The sole, but significant, problem is that this process irrevocably destroys the sample being examined. However, Yale University agreed to allow a team of scientists led by Garman Harbottle to cut a tiny fragment from the map. It was a multi-million-dollar thing. I was terribly nervous. I was on the edge of a nervous breakdown the whole time. I calculated later that the piece we cut off was worth $40,000 or $50,000. And, of course, you don't do that carelessly, you do it very carefully, Harbottle recalled. With extreme caution, Harbottle cut a thin piece from the map, dividing it into 6 separate samples. The first sample tested was dated to the 1950s. Believing such a modern date to be an error, possibly caused by contamination or an unsuccessful conservation attempt, Harbottle's team meticulously cleaned the surface of the remaining samples with acetone. The acetone, which is not supposed to affect parchment at all, extracted about 30% of the weight. In other words, a third of the weight of the parchment was extraneous material. That's a lot. 30%, Harbottle explained. After removing these foreign substances, he then tested the remaining parchment samples. Instead of 1950, they were dated to approximately 1440. Based on this data, Harbottle concluded that the Vinland Map was drawn on genuine medieval parchment. However, other scientists were puzzled by such a significant discrepancy in dates. When I first heard about the results of this, what I heard was crazy. One measurement said the map was modern, and the other said the map was old, one of them remarked. What could explain such radically different test results? One possible answer lay in a crude conservation attempt undertaken in the 1950s. Another explanation stemmed from the centuries-old process of transforming raw animal hide into finished parchment, which involved adding a special coating to ensure a smooth writing surface. Someone took an old piece of parchment dating to 1440, removed the surface, and replaced it with a new surface, one researcher suggested. This new surface could explain why the first sample, which was not subjected to acetone cleaning, dated to 1950. Thus, the body of the parchment proved to be ancient, but its surface was modern. The map we see today was put on the surface of the parchment, and so we can only conclude that the map was put on the parchment after 1950. These findings strongly suggest that the forger took ancient parchment, resurfaced it in the 1950s, and then drew the infamous Vinland Map on it. If this assumption is correct, it completely rules out Father Fisher, who died in 1944, as a suspect. Enzo Ferrajoli, therefore, remains at the center of this mystery, but any information he might have possessed about the forger's identity went to the grave with him in 1966. For almost 50 years, the Vinland Map has been an object of both admiration and condemnation. When it first appeared, it challenged the established dogma that Christopher Columbus discovered America, proclaiming the Vikings as the first Europeans to visit the New World. Ironically, although the Vinland Map is most likely a forgery, we now know through archaeological evidence that the Vikings were first, one commentary noted. So why do debates about the Vinland Map refuse to subside? The Vinland Map is still debated as if it's a matter of life or death. I think it's just a very natural human trait to argue about such things. I don't think the debate will ever stop. I think it's all part of the scientific quest that we are interested in getting answers to questions and finding out what's true, and then discarding speculations that are clearly not true. One scientist mused. Scientific evidence, it would seem, has unequivocally shown it to be a fake. Scientists are reluctant to accept it. Even now, new studies are being conducted, but they are unlikely to resolve the debate, it was emphasized. Science, by its very nature, is not concerned with absolute truth, but finds facts. The interpretation of these facts remains at the discretion of each individual. Given the facts we've seen with the Vinland Map, I conclude it's a fake. Other people still disagree.